Welcome to this week's episode of Hired. I am so excited for this week. For those of you new to the show, this is Hired. I'm your host, Mike, and it's a weekly show where we explore culture, diversity, and most importantly, the human connection with the help and guidance of weekly guests that I bring on. And I say weekly guest, and that's an understatement for who we have today. So I am so lucky, humbled, excited, as you could tell, to bring on Shaina. She is the head of talent acquisition at Grindr. And we're going to be exploring the moments that matter in the candidate experience. Now, before I bring her out, I want to set the stage for those of you that don't know her. I know a lot of people do that are going to be tuning in, but there's a lot of people that don't. There's some interesting things to know about her, obviously, and I just found this out recently, and we just talked about it backstage for them. She's a published poet, has amazing. If you get a chance, check it out. My personal favorites, At the Chateau or On Loss, have to read them. They're fantastic. But from a professional standpoint, I thought my research department here, because we have big budgets over at Spark TV here for Hired, I'm going to describe her the way that her peers have. So here's some adjectives that peers have used to describe Shaina: smart, mission-driven, passionate, positive, authentic. I like this one. Superhuman, and a big mind. But my favorite, and what you all will be able to witness here, is someone who exudes warmth, curiosity, excitement, and lights up a room. Please welcome my guest this week, Shaina. Welcome.
Hello, everyone.
How was that?
Hard to live up to. I hope I can, especially digitally, but thank you for the warm intro.
I said I was going to embarrass you a little bit, and we talked. I was actually going to quote some poem, but I'm not going to. But I've become a fan, and I've encouraged some new work, hopefully, that's going to be coming out. I really want to read some more. So, but before we jump into the topic today, there was something else that I thought was super topical, kind of something that I want to get your insights on. It's end of August. We're coming upon the fall season. Mm-hmm. If you're running Starbucks, what is the appropriate date to start launching the pumpkin spice latte?
Oh my gosh. Oh, this could be, we could spend all 30 minutes on this. I would say the appropriate date is, I'm gonna go with September 1st. I think it's just get in there. Don't wait for the equinox. Get ahead of it. The demand is there. The people want their pumpkin spice, and Starbucks is missing an opportunity.
Yeah, they seem to push it earlier every year. So I think you're going to get your wish on September 1st. So, and now insert massive segue into the candidate experience as we talk about moments that matter. And, you and I were chatting before, and the reason why I'm excited for this is everybody attacks this problem from a different lens, and super excited to have this discussion with you today. I think before we jump into how and those moments that matter in that, how would you define what the candidate experience is, and why do you think it's important not only for the attraction but the retention of top talent? I'm going to give you the big screen to kind of take this away.
Okay, what is the candidate experience? It's such a good question. I mean, there's so many ways to answer it. What I would say at the highest level is, traditionally, we would think of the candidate experience as the minute someone enters your formal recruiting process, right? So that candidate experience, sort of from a classic description, would start when the candidate submits their resume all the way through, when they sign their offer letter, and then bing, bang, boom, you're done. In some ways, the whole recruiting landscape has evolved and is really fused with the people ops landscape. And so we could very well think about candidate experience as someone's impression and understanding of your brand, your mission, your values, and how they fit into that throughout the life cycle of their work. So in some ways, the candidate experience is endless, right? Because you should be treating your internal staff as your future candidates. You should be hiring internally. You should be up-leveling people into new roles and new opportunities. So if you're not giving, in some sense, like the same attention, dedication, focus, right, to your current employees as well as your classic candidates, that's a missed opportunity, probably. And then in terms of where where it matters, where it shines, how we sort of focus that and make it crisp. I mean, that's we could spend hours on that. I think the number one thing I would say is candidate experience and is about authenticity, right? It's about enabling someone, regardless of who they are, how they identify, and whether they're a current employee or an actual traditional candidate, like enabling them to see where and how they fit into your company. What would that look like? What would it feel like? And I think the way that we have responsibility there is to translate, the brand, yes, but the feeling and sort of the safety of a company externally. And that's a big job. And I'm sure Spark feels that every day when you're trying to creatively translate this with video content or podcasts or interviews, right? It's the sense of, and the challenge we're still facing, it's how do you breathe life into your brand on paper, but then how do you enable other people to see themselves in the company and in sort of in the work, not just in photos on your website, right? But in the living and breathing work of that role. So that's an ongoing challenge, but it's one that I'm sure Spark is helping a lot of companies do well, and certainly something that Grindr is working on actively.
A couple of things there you touched on that I love. First of all, when you were talking about the candidate experience internally as employees as well, it reminded me of a quote that I read where they say, you're treated the best when you're a candidate. Like no time your company will treat you better when they're courting you to be a candidate, right? And you see that all the time, and it's a problem. It's cringeworthy, right? Or when they have to hire, they have to post it internally, but they're really excited to look externally. Just that attitude there, you kind of, once they come in, you forget that you still need to be thinking about them as candidates and keeping that experience whole. Is there anything that you've seen that helps create that type of experience after their employees in a positive way?
Oh my gosh, yes. Obviously benefits, right? Your benefits strategy is going to be huge. So I think when we when we talk about opportunity, we talk about treating your internal current employees always as candidates. There are going to be a few factors. One of them is for sure going to be your benefits package. So do you put your money where your mouth is as an employer? You might say you value diversity, equity, and inclusion. You might say that you value people having time off with their families, but what are your actual policies in practice, right? So Grindr is phenomenal at this. It has all the classic sort of tech benefits you'd want to see: unlimited vacation, incredible 401k match, flexible time off in all senses. But I think the thing that Grindr does that really stands out is actually its queer inclusive benefits practice. So it has a lot of additional benefits around gender affirmation, so covering the cost of any kind of gender affirmation surgery, travel, name change. Grindr helps cover the cost of hormone replacement therapy. Grindr connects queer identified employees with empathetic healthcare providers, et cetera. It's a very long list of comprehensive benefits. So that's one piece of treating your folks like candidates. I think the other piece is upskilling leaders. And this is something that, you and I have talked about several times. I think the biggest misstep a company can make of any size is under focusing on the value and impact of a leader. We all know the adage, right, that people leave managers, they don't leave companies. So, okay, yes, I think we're all on board, we agree. But what does that really mean? And how would a leader, for example, treat their teams like candidates? Part of that is having actual development conversations, right? And actually asking people where they want to go, what they're looking to do. And instead of hoarding your talent and hoarding your people, thinking about your team holistically as part of an organization, not part of your team or your squad or your function, right? But really thinking about every candidate that you interview, you're interviewing for the company, not just for your team. Every person on your team is a member of your team today, but really is a member of, Grindr, and where else could they go? If I had a recruiting coordinator who told me they wanted to be a software engineer, then we would work on a long-term transition path if there's opportunity, right? If they're good, their performance is strong, their passion is there, and we can find a way to make it work. we as leaders should be focused on opening those paths, because it's always better to retain incredible talent internally in the org than to lose people, right, to other organizations entirely.
And I think on that, to build on that, you hear all the time leaders say they need to bring in new perspective from the outside, different view. We need to disrupt, we need to innovate. So we need to bring somebody in from the outside. That can come internally from a different role, different department. Is that like, there's not enough of that looking internally. Like you said, like they're already a part of the organization somewhere. Let's bring someone that has been doing a function differently, that is going to attack this problem from a different lens, knowing that they already fit within the organization like that. And I feel like that's overlooked so much. There's something about, I don't know if it's an ego thing or, we need to get somebody from Google or Amazon to think differently because they do, and that will make us think that way. It's like just expanding that. And I think to your point, providing some of those development and training for leaders to have confidence doing that, right, themselves, which is just massive. So, on that kind of transitioning away in terms of looking at the process, and we talk about how it's something that's daunting to look at holistically. What do you think are a couple key moments within the candidate experience that are sometimes overlooked or maybe undervalued as opportunities to really elevate?
Oh, 100%. And again, a huge topic. We could write a book together about this one. I think but to noodle it down, we'll get a few focus areas. One is the application process, for a couple of reasons. I know that's a very unsexy answer, but it is generally the very first touch point someone has that's actually effort on their part beyond engaging with the brand to do something that shows that they're interested, right? They're actually flagging to this organization and putting in time, effort, energy, essentially money, because their time has value, to apply to your company. And so the first thing that matters is, how inclusive is that process? How easy is that process? I've seen companies today in 2022 that require you to create an account before you can even apply to an organization. That's pretty brutal. Okay. And I understand if you're, a 25,000 person conglomerate that's global, maybe because of, public rules, SEC, GDPR, you have to do that. But as much as you possibly can control this, any TA leader, anyone who's on a TA team, even if they're an individual contributor, they should start by going and actually applying for their own job. They should see what that's like. How inclusive does it feel? How long does it take? How many questions are people answering? Are those questions specific? Are they clear? Are they oddly worded? Is there EEOC information so people can opt to self-identify? All these pieces matter and are signals to a candidate about what you value or what you don't value as a company. So number one, for sure, take your own application process, audit it, shorten it, make sure that it is tight, it is clear, and you're actually asking for things that matter. So this is so minor, but a perfect example is, some people might have strong feelings about this, but the cover letter has in many ways gone by the wayside, right? Depending on the role that you're looking for. And so you need to dig deep. You need to think holistically about what the interview process is for, and make sure that you're not just replicating all of these applications with the same exact structure for every role. A cover letter really should not be required if writing and communication are not core competencies of the job. If you are hiring a level 1 engineer out of school and the majority of their work is going to be focused on tickets and helping, scrap code and figure out which code is clean and clean it up, how often do you need them to be writing a memo? There's no brief, right? That's really going to help you do that. So instead of thinking about what are shortcuts for you as an interviewer or a recruiter, think about what are shortcuts for the candidate. What's easier for the candidate? What's more seamless? That's a moment that really, really matters. The next big milestone, I would say, is that very first human-to-human touch point, right? So the moment a candidate actually connects with a recruiter, actually gets to that interview process and has the experience. That, in many ways, for me, is a make or break moment. I've seen a lot of trending posts these days on LinkedIn and other sites about candidates being more willing to opt out, which I actually think is fantastic. A candidate should not have to put up with offensive questions in an interview process. They absolutely are reading your interview process as a signal of what you value and what your culture is about. And so if candidates are more and more willing to opt out, every recruiter, every interviewer needs to think about what the purpose of their interaction is so that they're offering value for the candidate in that conversation. So in that recruiter interview, some things that Grindr has implemented that are really helpful are, if someone's stepping into a recruiter call, they have the opportunity to now record their name prior to that conversation so that a recruiter can recognize and name them professionally and perfectly and accordingly. And similarly, they have the opportunity to identify their pronouns, which you can imagine, especially at Grindr, is incredibly important and aligned with our values around recognizing people. From the recruiting perspective, it's just so critical that a recruiter care. It's not about numbers. A recruiter is always going to be better with making quality interactions and really showing up and remembering that every candidate's time is valuable and that they need to treat that with sensitivity. And so that moment of the recruiter interview, it's not a screen. We call it a recruiter interview for a reason, right? The candidate is going to interview Grindr as much as our recruiter is going to interview the candidate. And it is the recruiter's responsibility to make sure that person feels seen, is recognized with the proper name, pronunciation, and pronouns, and really, feels safe, because that will flow through the entire rest of the process. And then the last piece I would say, and we haven't talked about this together yet, but I would probably highlight closing as the last big piece of the candidate experience. It actually matters a lot. We talk about comp at the front end of every process because we value transparency and we don't want to waste people's time, right? And so one of the biggest missteps I still see in recruiting processes is recruiters or TA functions, being willing to put candidates through many, many, many rounds of interviews, knowing there's comp discrepancy, and then presenting an offer that is completely misaligned with what the candidate needs for their life, their family, their mortgage, their sick parents or caretaking, right? There are all these things. People have true numbers and true bottom lines that they need to be met to be willing to take an opportunity. And so at Grindr, we always have those conversations so that every offer, when we're having that closing call, is unsurprising, is aligned, and that leads to a really high, offer accept rate here at our company.
There is so much that I want to unpack there. Like, I feel like there's tons. I love what you and team at Grindr are doing in the recruitment side. And we talked about this. The role of recruiter is you're the reflection of the company and ultimately the first interaction that they're going to have with your organization. Whether you're an internal recruiter, whether you're an agency, engage with them. Like, and I find most organizations choose agencies not knowing that. Like, the agencies are mass emailing and kind of facelessly reaching out to people or having quick screen calls. That reflects on the candidate experience for your organization, even though you're not the ones doing it. So it's absolutely critical that as recruiters, you have that responsibility to reflect the brand, because your role is so important in the process. If it's a bad first interaction, they're already on alarm before they even engage with the organization. So I love what you're doing and kind of tackling that with empathy at the core. Anytime you talk to someone, it's from an empathetic position where they're going to be an employee at some point. Maybe right now is not the right time, but we're treating everybody like that. And I think more organizations need to create that sense of culture in their recruiting function to operate. Less about speed, less about coverage. They're not metrics, they're people. You're dealing with people. This isn't a speed game, right? So I love what you guys are doing so much in that space. And I agree with you completely on the offer side. And it's a hot topic about salary being posted on job descriptions, like putting salary up there. I like it. I think it should be you should say what it is. And it doesn't allow for this candidate, we're going to pay less because they're willing to accept it, or this one's way off and maybe we can get them down if they like the company and get them to that point. So more of that needs to be taking place for sure. So not a big shocker. I agree with everything you're saying. Now, you already talked about how organizations can run some self-assessments by going through their application process. Are there any other recommendations you have for maybe somebody outside of talent that's thinking like, what is my candidate experience, or how do I even know how I can improve it? Where would you direct them to start that journey and maybe kind of learn about it through different ways?
Oh, absolutely. And I probably will focus this answer still on leaders. I mean, it's essentially, interviewers and leaders, right? Our stakeholders through this journey who are co-owners of this process and ultimately incredibly impactful as well in the success of candidate experience, hire, and long-term success of the folks we have on staff. There are so many things that people can do to self-assess. So I'm going to start with the basics. The first is, come at this with low ego. Even if you're a hiring manager and a leader who's been building and hiring teams for 20 years, I guarantee you that you are not a perfect interviewer, even if you're very confident that you are, right? We always have room to improve. We can always do better with making the experience more inclusive. And so keep learning, right? Stay hungry. Work with your TA leaders on trainings if you don't have them internally, especially around unconscious bias, inclusive interview practices. Look for opportunities, even if it's free, to take courses, talk to your colleagues, figure out questions that get at the root of what you're trying to do. Use TA as a strategic partner to help continuously upskill yourself. Maybe even work with your executive coach if you suspect that, your interviewing skills aren't getting the signal that you need. So that's sort of baseline, like come at this with humility. Even if you're 20 years into your career, you can always do better. And it will make you a better leader because you'll pass that knowledge and that approach to the rest of your team, right? So you're also going to upskill and coach the next generation of interviewers on your team so that there's scalability. So that's a no-brainer. I think the second piece is look at tooling. Grindr doesn't use this yet because we're only 200 people. We're really small. We're actually a little under that number. But larger companies have had incredible success with tools like BrightHire that actually record the interview process, right? And will translate that process so that you can sort of go through and review yourself. How did your interview go? Where might there have been hot spots? That transcript of the interview can be shared with other interviewers. So if there's uncertainty about a candidate's answer to a question, the quality of their code, everything is actually codified and recorded so that the whole interviewing panel can cross-functionally look together to try to solve for, what the success or perhaps what the errors were like in the assessment of that candidate. So that's one big piece. The other thing that I would say is, work with your TA team to get feedback. Is your TA team in any way enabling candidates to speak back to the company? How do you know how the candidate experience went? If all you're doing is surveying your hires, then you have a success bias there, right? You have a survivorship bias. And so what Grindr does, for example, is we send, a candidate experience survey to 100% of candidates that make it to our final round interview, regardless of whether or not they got an offer, right? And so that's a significant number. The offer extension rate is good, but it's not a guarantee. It's usually about a 2-to-1 ratio. So roughly half of the folks that fill out our surveys are giving us feedback, even if they didn't make it through the final process successfully. And that feedback is the real window that we can use to sort of benchmark our success over time. So since I started at Grindr and we've implemented structured interviewing, pronoun usage, name pronunciation, all these things, we've used this data to see, an incredible trend and map that trend for candidate happiness. And we can share that data with hiring managers, other interviewers as well, because they're part of that journey and that success. So since 2021, we've seen a 30% increase in candidates having a positive interview experience with the company and a 60% increase in candidates saying that they have a more positive impression of the employer brand having gone through the interview process. Those are huge numbers, right? That can't be achieved overnight. That's achieved for all the reasons we've talked about. It's achieved because of structured interviewing, excuse my French, but just giving more shits, like trying harder, I think, from everyone's perspective, and investment in the process. A recruiter cannot carry the candidate experience on their own. It is not their job. The job of recruiters, the job of TA is to create a structured process and support hiring managers, leaders, and interviewers in carrying that baton with the rest of the team, right? Like, it's again, perhaps a cliche adage, but recruiting is a team sport. You cannot achieve a hire without the involvement of many, many people and the alignment of many, many people. And the data shows at Grindr, right, that when you put in the effort at the front end to do that good work and really scale and effectively scope your process from the outset, it has huge positive downstream impacts for candidates regardless of outcome.
Yeah, I like what you were saying there about, the leaders in the organization, and I find it fascinating. I love your insights. Is when organizations are thinking of promoting someone into a leadership position or any promotion, talent should be involved in that panel interview process, because ultimately leaders carry a mandate to grow or attract talent or retain talent in some capacity. And their interaction with TA is very important, because the perspective that you bring is how they interact with talent, and how, and you would have perspective to be involved in that process. But a lot of organizations don't. Like they make decisions on who should be in that hiring capacity without consideration of how they interact with talent and how they do that. I mean, it's a skill that doesn't get a lot of investment of time and energy or training. Like there aren't many internal programs that teach leaders how to recruit and how to hire, because they're different things. It's just, talent will get us the people, and like I'll interview them and tell them which one I want. It doesn't work like that anymore. Like you said, it's a team sport. Like you need to be involved up front in the process. And I think TA should be leveraged more to help decide who should even be in that position to begin with. Do you feel like that's a trend that's happening in the industry, where TA is being consulted more on who should be internally in these leadership positions?
Amen. Yes. I think the world, I mean, we could all say this, right? In the last 2 years, and still today continuing, the world has shifted so much. There has been so much thrash and impact for all of us. Like COVID has been a very traumatizing experience for many communities. It has changed the way we work. It has changed the way we think about building organizations. It has changed everything in the landscape of work, family, life, and what we need. So when I think about how things have changed in the last couple of years around this topic, I do think that the landscape and the vision of sort of HR, people ops, TA as a holistic part of the business strategy has shifted. I think it's continuously becoming more and more valued and more important, because people are realizing that, people practices, unsurprisingly, are foundational to your business success. I mean, it should be a no-brainer, but, we all are self-selecting, of course, into this conversation because we love people practices and recruiting. But many people have not historically valued that in the same way, right? Because it can be harder to quantify. For many years, I think the thing that HR and TA did not do well was quantifying impact. And so when I think about the changing landscape, I think, HR and people functions in general have gotten much better at using data to actually quantify and look at what are the long-term impacts of these. How do we roll out a program that we think seems light or silly today, but actually we find out dramatically impacts retention, which ultimately then impacts the business's bottom line in 2 to 3 years. So that's a really positive trend. I think what recruiting should take out of that especially is that the role of a recruiter, even if it's a level, it's your first job, if it's your first recruiting job ever, you're going to be so much more successful in the short and medium and long term if you tie yourself very closely to your people practices, because candidates expect that knowledge from you now. It's not enough to just say, hey, you're going to code in Java and it's going to be super awesome and you're going to help us develop this mobile and web product and maybe you'll touch a little bit of Kotlin and come join the team. It'll be great. You now need to be able to talk about what your retention practices are, what your pay practices are, the structure and function of the team and the organizational design, where this person could career path themselves. Candidates have really, in a fantastic way, become empowered around asking all of these things and weighing them in their decisions. And so the more well-versed as a recruiter you are in sort of the broader scope of the, we'll say, like candidate and employee life cycle of what your company offers, that positions you for success so much more than just being able to go find people online, sell the job in 15 minutes and, try to get a close. So that has just shifted so much. And it's a great trend. I encourage it. I'm a huge fan. I'm okay if the lines blur a little bit, between HR and TA, because I think the more that those two functions can upskill each other and partner closely, the more effectively, again, you pass the baton. Because what we keep going back to is, what is candidate experience? It doesn't end at the offer either, right? So you have this whole hiring team. They work in concert. It's a beautiful thing to witness. They have a thoughtful debrief. They extend an offer. Awesome. You land the candidate. Now what, right? There's still a whole host of personal information and important information about what that person values and why they signed on to the company the TA has to pass off to HR to ensure that it's smooth and it's a beautiful transition through onboarding, through future people decisions, all of that stuff. And then to get to a more specific example, you started by talking about how do we think about the role of leaders in terms of assessing talent and how involved is TA, right? And to which I say, we involve HR in every leadership role in the company. So if we know that any company role here at Grindr is going to have direct reports, we have a leadership interview. And the entire focus of that specific leadership interview, right, in the structured process is to assess how does this person find talent? How do they coach and upskill talent? How do they provide feedback? And how do they retain talent? Because Grindr absolutely, considers this one of the sort of the four core responsibilities, we'll say, of a Grindr leader. So I think there's a lot of greatness there. Many companies are adopting that practice. But the thing for recruiting to think about is, even if your company believes that leaders should be retaining and attracting talent, have you actually tied that back to your interview process? And if you haven't, you need to go back and assess where that's missing so you can add it and ensure that you're vetting for that skill as part of hiring a leader for your company.
Yeah, well said. I think, it's interesting you talk about quantify how marketing departments have gotten really good at figuring out if you do this, how it expects the lifetime value of a customer, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the real metrics. We're new to that on the people side, but that's where it's going. Like if organizations claim people are your biggest asset, prove it. Like, what do you know about all of these things? Like, what data are we collecting to know how that works? And we need to be thinking more like marketers as we go through the people ops process. So I know we've taken a lot of your time. I want to end with, what are you excited about with the future at Grindr? Like I there's so much here, but like, what are you excited about the future?
Oh my gosh. Thank you for asking this question and saving space for us to celebrate. I think like life should end, all things should end on a sweet note. So very short version, super excited to continue to partner, hopefully with companies like Spark doing really cool work that's innovative. And that's really the direction that we want to go. Grindr has done a phenomenal job in the last year and a half, especially, of recruiting great talent, upshoring, our values and our benefits to really reflect, the culture and the mission and supporting the queer community. So the next phase is innovation. I can't wait for next year. I want to break the mold on recruiting. I want us to experiment with getting better at determining signal versus noise. I want our experience to be world-class for candidates, but different and easier. I think the resume is so antiquated. Nobody likes it. Even recruiters don't like resumes, right? It is almost unfair in some ways to ask someone to boil their entire work history, life experience into one page, right? It is a huge ask. It is a keywords game. In many ways, it's set up for inequity, right? It's not a structure that has been set up for fairness or evaluating or truly getting signal in the right ways. So what I would love to see Grindr do and what we hope to do in 2023 start to roll out some atypical interview processes and try to figure out, can we say goodbye to the resume and offer candidates a new way to present themselves, talk about themselves? And this ties so closely to the work you do, right? It's about stories. Like, how do we empower candidates to think more deeply about who they are and what their story is, and to tell us that in a more inclusive and easy way than keywords on a one sheet of paper. So that's what we're looking forward to, and continuing to grow the company, of course, as we do that.
Awesome. And where can people find you? Where can they connect with you online?
Totally. I'm always available via email. Maybe that's dicey to put out there, but I love connecting with people. So if anyone's interested in a role, has questions, wants to connect, wants to ideate on TA, they can reach me at shaina@grindr.com. Very easy. Otherwise, LinkedIn is the best place. Also available. Anyone can connect with me, and happy to message and share best practices with folks as it makes sense.
And I highly encourage you all to follow Shaina on LinkedIn. Her content's great, what she puts out there, and just to follow along on the Grindr journey is certainly something that I enjoy, and I know you will as well. Thank you so much for coming this week. It was a great conversation. We could have taken each one of these topics for a run for longer than the time is today, and maybe we'll have to do a follow up when we start dabbling in some innovative techniques to share what we're doing. So Thanks so much for coming on. Thank you, everybody that tuned in to this week's episode. And we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everyone.